Good evening, creatures of the night. I hope you enjoy this episode of Dogman Among Us in Ohio. Please stay tuned afterwards for an update on my book and a sneak peek as I read one of the chapters to you. The digital copy is available now, and the link is in this description. Now, get ready for Dogman, and don't miss your chance to scream. When I was in my 20s, I was living in Ohio and I saw a dogman. This thing was looking right in my window at me like he was watching a movie or something. It was around 9 o'clock when it happened, and it was just myself, my roommate Dan, and his girlfriend Chris at the time. They were off in a different room while I was in the kitchen cooking for all of us, before we settled down to watch a movie. At first I heard this tapping coming from the window. Not a knock, just a slight tapping. And it was so quiet I didn't even bother turning around. But I know that's what I heard. Then I heard this rubbing noise, like when you wipe water off of a window. I'm sure you know the noise I'm talking about. That's when I turned around and saw this huge wolf looking in the window at me, breath fogging up the glass and everything. To say this head was colossal gives you an idea of just how big this thing was. It was bigger than any wolf or dog or coyote I've ever seen, even on episodes of the Wild Kingdom. Its mouth was open slightly, and this long, pink tongue curled out of it. It was breathing a little hard, hence the steam on the window, I guess. It had these huge yellow eyes and big, long ears that were pointy at the top. And it was a dark gray color. It looked like a German Shepherd, but the color was all wrong. And the size was definitely not something a German Shepherd can grow to. Holy shit, I yelled. Well, honestly, I think it came out a little more shrill than a yell. This thing just stared right back at me, unfazed that I saw it. Naturally, I ran from the room, grabbing the kitchen knife as I did. I ran to my friends and hysterically tried to tell them what it was that I saw. Of course, they didn't believe me. Chris said that I was pulling their leg, but I swore to them that I was telling the truth. And Dan said it was probably just the neighbor's dog or something. But the way the kitchen's built into this house, that window is so high that if I were to go outside and stand underneath it, it would still be above my head. So this thing had to be 7, 8, maybe even 9 feet tall. I told them if they didn't believe me, then go in the kitchen and look for themselves. And they did. I followed behind them slowly. And it didn't take long for them to believe me, because this thing was still at the window, looking in it, looking around the kitchen, like it was just curious to see what was in there. They both screamed, and Dan started yelling at it to go away. It stared at him for a minute, as he continued to yell at it and fling his hands, motioning for it to leave. Chris and I were yelling at him to stop yelling, and we were both pulling at him, trying to get him out of the kitchen. I thought he was insane for yelling at this thing. For all I knew, there was a werewolf outside, and I was terrified at the thought of it getting in the house and killing all 3 of us. Chris started to cry. She wanted to leave. She said she was going to the car, and if we didn't follow us, she was going to leave us there. My mind was racing at this entire situation going on. It was just too much for me to comprehend. I wanted to get out of that situation as fast as possible, but I didn't exactly want to risk going outside to the car and being mauled to death or eaten by this thing. All we could do was stare at it as it stared back at us. Then out of the blue, it turned around and walked away. And it walked away on 2 legs. This freaking thing was a biped. It looked like a wolf, and it wasn't afraid of us. I mean, what else could this thing be besides a werewolf? After that, we didn't waste any time getting to the car and getting the hell out of there. We drove to Chris's house, called the cops, and told them what we saw. They actually accused us of playing a prank on them, told us we were wasting their time, and hung up on us. Yeah, thanks for all the help. We could have been killed by a werewolf, and you guys are telling us that we're playing a prank. We stayed at Chris's house the rest of the night, obviously getting no sleep at all. And the very next day, Dan and me put our notice in with our landlord and told them we were breaking our lease. I'd like to share my encounter with you. It's about an encounter that me and my boyfriend had. I won't tell you my name or his, or where exactly we live, but I will say we're from Ohio. I'll come right out and say that I never saw anything that night, but what I heard will haunt me forever. This was a few years ago, when we first started to date. At the time, he lived with his grandparents, out in the middle of nowhere on the back roads. His grandparents lived on a farm, owned by another family that lived down the road. I'd been there all day, just watching TV, and I was bored. So, I asked him if he could take me on a ride with one of the four-wheelers and drive me around. He asked permission from the family that owned the farm, and they said yes, because they owned the four-wheelers too. Off we went, out into the fields to ride around. By the time we went up to the hill where our encounter happened, it was already starting to get dark. So, I said we should probably head back. On our way back, as luck would have it, the four-wheeler stopped running. At first, I thought it was just a stupid joke he was playing on me, but when he asked me to get off and help him, I knew it wasn't a joke. The sun was now almost completely set, and I was starting to get a little scared. The only light we had was from the headlights of the four-wheeler. We were surrounded by woods, and I had that feeling of being watched, to the point where the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up. No matter what I did to try and calm down, I couldn't shake this feeling. We were about halfway down the hill when the really creepy shit started happening. First, I noticed that it was dead silent. The crickets, the birds, even the cows on the farm weren't making a sound. I grew up going camping and playing in the woods, and I knew that when it was silent, that wasn't a good sign. The creepy feeling started getting worse. Now it was completely dark at this point. I asked my boyfriend if we could just leave the four-wheeler up there and come back and get it tomorrow, but he said no, because he would have been in trouble. We continued pushing it down the hill, when suddenly this ear-piercing howl-type scream came from the woods. I froze in my tracks. I couldn't move. I looked at my boyfriend, and he just stared at me with these wide eyes. What the hell was that? I managed to ask him. He didn't know what it was, though. I was almost in tears at this point. I was really scared. Even with all the noises I've heard in the woods, I couldn't place this one. It wasn't a coyote, or a wolf, or a dog. It was a cross between a scream and a shout. The closest thing I can compare it to would be the Bigfoot sounds on those TV shows. After the howl stopped, the forest sounds still didn't start up again. It was completely silent, and I still had that bad feeling. When we finally got down the hill, I ran into the house. I asked him again what that was, and he still couldn't give me an answer. I grew up hearing stories about the Ohio Grassman, and that could have been what we heard that night. The next day, one of the farmhands went up to the hill and found a deer ripped to shreds, and its tongue was torn out. Needless to say, I never went over that hill again, or out at night around there. I hope you share my story so that I can see if other people in Ohio have had the same thing happen to them. I'm glad I never saw what made the noise that night, because I probably would have had a heart attack right there on the spot. To this day, I'm not completely sure what it was. There's always a bunch of encounters in Ohio, especially where I live, because there's lots of woods and back roads. My family and myself had had many experiences with hearing weird things at night in the woods. None of us can explain them. The place we heard this noise is about 30 miles from Germantown, and me and my boyfriend believe it wasn't the grassman we heard, but a dogman. What do you think? My name is Kelly. I'm a 34-year-old woman from Ohio. I have 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. I have a dog and a husband. I've been married to him for 12 years. I'm a receptionist at a dental office. I'm normal, average. Nothing extraordinary about me, except for the story that I have to tell you. It happened in Ohio, close to Germantown, but not in Germantown. It was dusk, and it was September 20th, 2003. I was coming home from visiting my parents, My dad had a near miss with some medical issues, and 2 weeks prior, he had surgery. So, visiting them daily was something that I was doing at that point. I didn't have any kids yet, and I was just starting to date my now husband. I was about 30 minutes away from my home, on this back road when it happened. Now, the road that I was on is this curvy road, and since it was starting to get dark out, I was going slower than I normally would during the day. I remember the sun glaring in my eyes, and I was starting to look for a pair of sunglasses right before this happened to me. I was going even slower as I was looking for my sunglasses, and when I looked up, I saw this big mass on the shoulder of the road. At first glance, I thought it was just a bush, but the closer I got, I saw that this thing was actually an animal. The only thing I saw at first was the coat. It looked thick and shaggy to me, so I thought it was a bear. We don't have a lot of bears in Ohio, but I know there's a few small populations of bears in our state. And I'm not gonna lie, at first I was excited at the thought of seeing a bear in the wild. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the decreasing sunlight, and I got closer to this thing, my eyes started to focus on it, and I realized that if it was a bear, it had to be a badly misshapen bear. The way it was crouched down wasn't like an animal at all, and in fact, it almost had this human quality. When I think back, it had to have a human quality. It was just sitting like no animal would ever sit. And then, whatever this thing was, looks right up at me. This was no bear at all. Actually, it looked more like a wolf. But, as far as I know, there are no wolves in Ohio. But this thing was definitely canine-like. From what I saw at this point, it had a long muzzle, not a short stubby muzzle like a bear. It had big pointy ears, and its eyes were reflecting the light. When it looked up at me, it snarled, and I could see these big giant teeth. I noticed it had a long bushy tail, and it looked gigantic, even sitting in that position. It wasn't crouching, it was more sitting on its side, kind of like those pictures you see of mermaids where they're sitting off to the side position. That's what this thing was doing. And then I noticed that next to its body was the mangled body of a poor little deer. It looked like something had grabbed it and started ripping it apart. There was blood on the side of the road. Like this thing had killed it right there and started to eat it. Maybe it got hit by a car and this thing found it and started eating it like it was scavenging the body. I don't know. But I know from that amount of blood, it had to be a fresh kill. I stopped my car. I know it was stupid, but I was just too scared to pass because I didn't know what this thing was that I was looking at, and I didn't know what it would do to me if I passed by it. It was gigantic. I have no idea what this thing was capable of, but I knew that I didn't want to find out. It bared its teeth at me again, and now I could see the blood on its mouth and its teeth, and there were bits of flesh on its muzzle. Even sitting down like that, I knew that this thing had to be huge. And then, it shifted its body weight, and I thought it was going to stand up on all fours, but to my astonishment and horror, this thing stood up on 2 legs. I was terrified. This thing was taller than tall. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, and I'm not exaggerating. It was massive. Muscles on top of muscles on top of muscles. It had long arms that were almost down to its knees, and it had these clawed hands at the ends of each arm. The way it stood reminds me of how a canine stands, like with their toes. Its hair was dark and long and shaggy, but it was still standing there looking more human than any animal ever should. If I wasn't mistaken, and if I didn't know better, I would say that I was looking at an honest-to-God werewolf. The hair on his chest was thinner and lighter, and I could actually see the muscles on this thing's chest. Its thighs were bigger than any man's muscles that I've ever seen in my entire life. The hair around its head and shoulders was shaggy and darker, and almost looked like a mane compared to the rest of its body. And it made this thing look even more intimidating than it already did. And then, as if I needed to be any more scared than I already was, this thing started walking, still on two legs, towards the street, until it was standing there in the middle of the road, with its arms down, but its palms facing me. It was glaring at me, like it was daring me to pass by. At this point, I was shivering, because I was so scared. I was starting to sweat. My mouth was dry, and it felt like I couldn't see or hear anything else but what was right in front of me. This thing didn't move any closer to me. It just stood there, staring at me and baring its teeth. I watched the meat and blood dangle from its mouth. It was still baring its fangs, like it was angry or something that I stumbled upon it. And I could see those huge canines. In fact, when I close my eyes, I can still see those huge canines. I could have sworn also that the rest of its teeth were pointed as well. There was no doubt in my mind that this thing was an absolute killing machine. It pivoted on one foot, glanced over at its kill, and I guess it decided that I wasn't worth it because it started walking like a normal human man on two legs and grabbed the fawn. It looked like he just tucked it right under his arm, and he took off into the tree line. It didn't run. It didn't even move that quickly. This thing just casually walked over there like it had nothing to fear, like it knew that it was on top of the food chain, the top of the entire world. It grabbed that little deer, muscled it up under its own arm, and just walked off casually. I got the intense feeling that this thing was mad as hell that I stumbled upon it, but on the other hand, it's like it didn't care. It wasn't intimidated by me, that's for sure. It was just like it was mad and inconvenienced and wanted to go somewhere else so it could eat that deer in peace. I sat there for a minute, staring at the trees, right to the spot where it went, but at this point, it was now almost completely dark and the sun was almost gone. I couldn't see it anymore, so I turned back around and went right back to my parents' house. I didn't want to go home because I knew that my roommate wasn't home yet, and I definitely didn't want to be alone after having an encounter with that thing. The whole way back to my parents' house, I was speechless. It was like my brain was numb. I guess I was trying to comprehend what it was that I just saw. I've heard the tales and the legends of the Dogman being seen around Germantown, and all those other places like Bray Road and Michigan, but I never gave it two thoughts that it was actually real. When I got back to my parents' house, they were confused as to why I was back, but they could also tell that I was visibly scared. And I guess my mom actually helped me into the house. The next 10 or 15 minutes, I don't actually remember at all. My parents told me later that I was babbling about what I had seen. I told them something along the lines of, it was a werewolf. I saw a werewolf. They couldn't really make anything else out that I was babbling about, other than that I was thirsty. I guess I told them everything that I saw, described the monster a few minutes later, and even said that it was feasting on that deer, and that it carried it away into the woods. I don't remember telling them anything like that. I do remember later that we talked about what I could have been that I saw. I was still convinced that I'd seen a werewolf, but my parents were convinced that I did in fact see the Dogman, and admitted that sometimes they hear these weird howling noises. Not like a wolf, or a dog, or even a coyote. Something different. My dad described it as out of this world. It's not close to their property. It's off in the distance, but it's still loud enough to send shivers down their spines. I still to this day have to drive down that road sometimes, but I try to avoid it like the plague. If I have to drive down that road, it's in broad daylight. And in fact, I try to avoid it so much that even if it adds extra time to my commute, I'm fine with that. I've never seen that thing again, but believe me, I'm very aware of all my surroundings every time I'm on that road, and anywhere near that road as a matter of fact. I try to almost never drive down that road with my children, unless it's in the middle of the day. And I will actually go very far out of my way if I have to avoid driving down that road at night if my kids are in the car. You hear all these stories about people witnessing these creatures, or other creatures for that matter, that they can't identify. Things that shouldn't really exist. Fairy tales. Stories. You never expect it to be you that's the one that has the encounter. You never expect that you're the one that's going to be on a website reading about these things, making sure that it was the same thing that you encountered. You never expect that you're going to be the one that's emailing someone that you've never met, telling him your story and letting him post it on his YouTube channel. Thank you for doing what you do. I never want to see this thing again, but I would like some closure. I guess I was just there at the wrong place at the wrong time. What do you think? My name is Lenny. I was 11 years old, almost 12 at the time of this encounter, and I'm 55 years old now. I'm actually writing you this on my birthday, and this is the first time I've talked about it in a long time. This is the very first time I've ever put it to paper and sent it to somebody to tell my story for me. I figured as a birthday treat this year, I'd tell my favorite YouTube narrator what it was that I saw so many years ago. When we saw the Dogman, we were on an unofficial camping trip with our Boy Scout unit, and it was in Brush Creek State Forest. That's in Ohio. The year was 1976. There were 11 other boys that went on this trip, but only 6 of us, including myself, and 1 scout leader saw this thing. For years and years, I had no other term besides wolfman or werewolf, or even monster. But now, thanks to the things on YouTube and the Sci-Fi Channel, and even the Discovery Channel, I can say that what I saw was most likely a Dogman. This wasn't one of those camping trips where you pitch a tent and earn some hours and badges to prove that you can move up the ranks of Boy Scouts. This camping trip didn't actually count for Boy Scout units at all. We just wanted to go on another camping trip because the last time we did it, it was so much fun. And that was the time we actually got to earn hours and badges so we could move up in the ranks. At the time of this, I was a tenderfoot, and I was eager to move up to the next rank, but this camping trip actually scarred me for a long time, and I ended up leaving the Boy Scouts after this. One thing I'd like you to know about myself is that I absolutely love the outdoors. I did then, and I even do now, although it took me a long time to go back into the woods. And now as an adult, I'm a lot more cautious, and I never go into the forest without a firearm. Back then as a boy, I would go hiking all the time with my father, even in the parts where I saw this Dogman before the encounter happened, and I never saw anything out of the ordinary until that day. I've been in that forest more times than I can count since then too, and even after that encounter I haven't seen anything strange. But I know it's out there now, and I'm always looking over my shoulder, expecting another encounter with one of these creatures. I believe that the smaller our forests get, and the larger our numbers get in population, the chances of meeting these creatures are always expanding. One day, I expect somebody to bring in proof that these creatures actually exist. Anyways, on to what I saw. We were hiking one afternoon. It was me, 5 other boys, and one of our scout leaders. We decided to split into 2 groups, and I just happened to be in the group that was in the direction that the Dogman encounter happened. Lucky me, right? During the hike, we heard this commotion like nothing I've ever heard before. There was this dog barking and snarling like it was fighting for its life, and this other noise that sounded more like a roar, and this squeal all combined into one. But it was deep and unnatural, for lack of a better term. 2 of the boys, and oddly enough the 2 boys that were usually the ones that got in trouble, ran off in the direction of this noise to see what was going on. You'd think if you were in the forest and you heard these god-awful noises like that, you'd be a little more cautious, right? Not these 2. So they ran off towards what sounds like World War III, and obviously our scoutmaster, a man named Jim, went after them. The rest of us boys had the sense not to go in the direction that all these noises were coming from, but we ended up chasing after Jim anyway. We come up to this clearing in this little field area, and that's when we saw something that gave me nightmares for years to come. There in the middle of this field was this big black dog, jumping and snarling and biting at this gigantic werewolf creature. The dog itself must have weighed 100 pounds. It had long, shaggy black hair. It had droopy ears and was pretty muscular for a dog. He had this long tail that had all his hair hanging off of it, and thinking back on it now, that dog probably could have passed for a hippie. But even the sight of this big dog that was lunging and snarling couldn't compare to the other creature that was in that field. If that dog weighed 100 pounds, then this thing must have weighed 300 pounds. It towered over the other dog, and that was when it was on all 4 feet. It had long shaggy fur too, but this fur was a dark gray color, with specks of brown mixed in some of the hair. It had big ears on the top of its head, and teeth that looked like it could eviscerate that dog if it got a hold of it. This thing looked more muscular than any animal I've ever seen in my entire life. And this creature had a long shaggy tail too. But the weird thing about this creature was, it was swiping at this dog. What kind of canine swipes its claws out when it's fighting? And while we're on the subject of its paws, this thing didn't look like it had paws at all on the front limbs. It was using hands to swipe at this dog. This thing looked more like it had the hands of a raccoon than the paws of a dog. It had fingers that were articulated to grab a hold of things. The scene itself, when all of us boys and our scout leader got there, was pretty chaotic. You had a couple of us yelling that we wanted to go back, and a couple of us yelling what the heck was going on. All of us were yelling. Some in fear, some in curiosity, but either way, all these young boys yelling at the top of their lungs, things got pretty loud. Jim was shishing us, trying to get us to all calm down, but I don't think that those 2 dogs that were fighting could hear anything over the noises that they were making. Jim was telling us all to get back and get out of the way and run back to camp because he didn't want us to get attacked by either of those creatures. But he looked like he couldn't pull his eyes away from the battle himself. I think he was more curious than any of us boys were. And that dog just kept lunging and snapping at this werewolf creature, and it was barking its head off. But those barks, even as loud as they were drowned out by the screams that this werewolf creature was making. Sitting here now, trying to type this story out to you, I'm having a hard time describing just what this roar sounded like. If you've ever been to a zoo where there's lions, and you hear one of the lions roar, you know that you could feel it inside of your body because it's so deep. That's how it felt when this thing roared, but not how it sounded. It was this primal roar. It sounded like it could be a mixture of a man and an animal, and it was deafening. There were parts of it that sounded high-pitched, but also parts of it that were so deep that you could feel it in your eardrums when they rumbled inside your head. Jim was still trying to wrangle all of us kids up, trying to pull us away from the scene and push us back towards camp, but some of our curiosities were just so heightened that we wanted to stay and watch, and we were trying to hide behind this big tree so we could get a good look at what was going on. And then I noticed that across the clearing was this man yelling to the dog. It was yelling at the other creature too, but it was calling the dog, trying to get it to come away from this thing, trying to get it to heel, to run. But obviously, this dog wasn't listening, and it was entangled in this fight with this creature, where I was sure was going to be a fight to the death. And I still, to this day, remember the name of that dog. The dog's name was Jojo. From what I could tell, Jojo looked like he was bleeding, but he still didn't back down and kept lunging at this creature. I don't know if Jojo was trying to defend his owner or trying to defend himself because this werewolf attacked him, but either way, this dog was definitely brave. The dogman, or werewolf, or whatever it was, kept swatting and roaring, trying to get to this dog, but every time the dogman swatted, Jojo would dodge out of the way and lunge at him. I could see wounds on the limbs of this dogman, and one on its face where the blood was trickling by its ear, but it didn't look like Jojo was doing much damage to this werewolf monster at all. I could tell, though, that Jojo was definitely wounded. Finally, that werewolf creature, I guess, had had enough, and turned tail and ran off into the forest. When it ran, it almost looked like a primate does when it runs, but I guess this could have been because one or both of the front legs were injured by Jojo during the fight. Then, Jojo the dog chased the werewolf into the tree line, and you can hear it roaring as it ran away. But Jojo didn't actually follow him into the trees. He turned around and came running back to the guy that was screaming at him. And that damn dog was even wagging his tail as he came back to his owner. I guess that was the point where Jim figured it wasn't safe anymore, like it was safe in the beginning. But since that werewolf wasn't distracted by Jojo anymore, he figured that thing could turn around and turn its sights on us. So he told us that now we definitely needed to get the hell out of there and get back to camp. I remember Jim had to physically carry Bradley Bowman out of there because he wouldn't leave the scene. Bradley was actually one of the kids that ran off in the first place, so he deserved a good ass whooping if you ask me. But Jim was basically hissing at us that we needed to get the hell out of there or he was going to whoop us all himself. As we ran through the woods, I could see that all of us, including myself, were absolutely scared, and we needed to get back to our camp so we could feel the safety of our larger numbers, and possibly even get out of there. The whole way back to camp, Jim just kept telling us it was a wolf. He just kept repeating, "It was just a big wolf. It was just a big wolf." Yeah, right. That sure as hell was no regular wolf that dog was fighting. Maybe a werewolf, but sure as hell no regular wolf. When we did get back to our campsite, Jim ran over to our other scout leader, an older man that we called Mr. Thomas, and they walked out a ways to have a conversation. When they came back, both of them seemed agitated, and we ended up going home early that same day. They told us that it wasn't safe there because there was a wolf running around, and Mr. Thomas had been radioed that we needed to evacuate the area. Honestly, I think they made the whole thing up. I think Jim told Mr. Thomas what he'd really seen, and they decided that it was in our best interest to just get the hell out of the area. I don't know if Jim used the word wolf, or if he used the word werewolf during his conversation with Mr. Thomas, but whatever was said during that conversation made Mr. Thomas think twice about staying there for another night, and it made him just as nervous as Jim was. When we got back though, basically, the whole thing was covered up as a wolf encounter. I'll ask you again, what kind of canine creature swipes its claws out during a fight? A wolf doesn't do that. This thing had hands too, not paws. This thing was bigger than any wolf or dog I have ever seen. It definitely wasn't a wolf. For years, all of us boys that kept in touch stuck to the stories from what we saw with our own eyes. We knew what we saw. We knew it wasn't a wolf. Unfortunately though, as the years passed, all of us started to go our own ways and lose touch with each other. Some of us moved out of the state, others passed away, but I don't actually keep in touch with any of the boys that I was in that troop with, let alone the rest of them that saw that creature when I did. In my research on this creature, I've come to the conclusion that what I encountered was not a full-grown dogman, even though it looked huge to an 11-year-old boy, don't get me wrong. Compared to that dog, it looked huge too, but usually a dogman sighting has an even more massive creature than what I witnessed. That actually sends shivers down my spine thinking about it. This thing was gigantic and dwarfed all of us, and Jojo. I can't imagine something that looks that ferocious being even bigger. I think it was a young male dogman that tried to pick a fight with his dog, instead of steering clear of it, and the dog ended up fighting back. Had this been a full-grown dogman, I believe the outcome would have been drastically different, and that poor dog would have just been an afternoon snack. But because this dogman was either a juvenile or a young male, it didn't have the mass or the experience that an older dogman would have, and Jojo was able to chase it off. One thing's for sure though, I will never look at the forest the same way. I respected the forest back then, but now I have this deep, deep respect for the forest and the creatures in there that we know of, and the creatures that hide in the shadows that we can't even think of. Sincerely, Lenny. I've been seeing what I call werewolves pretty much since I've been little, and I've had encounters with them ever since then too. Nothing really ever happens with them. We just look at each other and they end up going about their business. But I did have one terrible encounter. and it was the most horrible and terrifying thing that I've ever encountered. It was when I was truck driving in Ohio. I still have nightmares about it, actually. I parked my shipper receiver one night. I dropped my trailer I'd been pulling because it takes a while for them to unload and load my trailer. I got there the evening before I was supposed to be there. I dropped the trailer and pulled out from under it and parked away from it just on the other side of this dirt parking lot. This place is kind of near the woods, and not many people live around here. There's actually a lot of woods around it. I pulled my front curtains in my cab and left my truck running and cooked some food for me and my pit bull. He always comes with me. He's my baby boy. After we ate, it was getting dark, and I took him for a walk before we'd settle in for the night. That's when I would go play some Modern Warfare with my squad. My boy was acting kind of weird though, looking all around and sniffing. Not really like him at all. It was like he was in serious protective mode when we were walking around those woods. It was way too quiet where we were too. No bugs, nothing making any kind of noise. He finally settled down and we went back to my truck and I got on my Xbox. A few hours later, he starts acting very protective again and starts growling at the side of the truck where I was sitting, which would be the passenger side. I just thought I made him mad or something, so I started loving on him, but he wouldn't stop growling and staring at that side of the truck. So I decided to take off my headset and listen. And that's when I could hear the unmistakable sound of something outside walking around by me. It sounded big, and it sounded really close to the area of the truck that I was in. Then, out of nowhere, I heard this deep, guttural growl. It sounded off right next to the door, and then the truck rocked back and forth. Our trucks are heavy, and it takes a lot to rock the truck side to side, but this thing rocked my truck nonetheless. I'm gonna admit, I started to freak out a little bit. My boy jumped into my lap to protect me. I mean, his hair was up, he was growling, he scared the hell out of me. He's never done that before. It was a very serious, tense moment, but it was also a huge comfort to know that he was so protective over me. I finally got up because something told me to just check my doors. I needed to make sure they were locked. So I started with the passenger side, since that's where I was at. I pulled the curtain back to take a peek, and I looked down at the side of my cab. I still regret looking down there to this day. There was this huge, bulky, tall werewolf, and it had these glowing red eyes. I'll never forget the way it looked when it was beside the truck. It was around 8 feet tall, and had a very muscular body, like a bodybuilder. It had long, hairy arms, with human-like hands, and these razor-sharp claws at the end of them. If you've ever seen the movie Bad Moon, it looked almost exactly like that, but it had very dark brown or black hair, instead of gray. And it had those red eyes that just seemed to glow in the night. And just looking into them, you could tell that it wanted to harm me. It was something that I want to forget. It's something that I wish I could still forget, and I wish I never would have seen. I mean, I was frozen in place by looking into his eyes, and so damn scared, down to my very soul. Like I said, I've been seeing creatures like this my whole life, but none like this. This one was different than the rest. This one was evil, and it was dangerous, and I really think it wanted to kill me. I knew that I might lose my life that night. My dog attacked the side of the truck, and it seemed to snap me out of my fear. My mind was racing, billions of thoughts a second. I really couldn't focus, but I went to look back and realized that my door was not locked, and the curtain was still open. And it looked like this thing was reaching for the damn handle. I freaked out and slammed the door lock button. It locked, and about the same time, this creature started pulling the handle, and it wouldn't open, thank God. When it realized the door was locked, it seemed to piss it off. I mean, seriously, piss this thing off. It let out this awful howl that was so loud and terrible that I could feel it vibrating inside of my bones. It freaked me out even more, and I was laying down on the floor crying and praying for my life. Then, my guardian angel, my dog, my boy, he's down on the floor nudging me, licking me, whining, telling me that it's okay, that he was scared too, and we just needed to get the hell out of there. I came back to my senses. I jumped in the driver's seat and ripped down the curtain. I slammed the stick shift into gear and tried to get away. But I forgot I had the parking brake on. I slammed it in and started to drive off. I finally hit the road and then turned onto the main street and almost wrecked because I was going way too fast. From where we were, there was this field that was about the size of a football field. That was from the warehouse to the road. I looked through the field, and from there, where we were, I saw that werewolf still standing there. And then he took off running on his back two legs, and within just a few seconds, he was right there, almost to the road. He ran with his arms stretched out, and his very big teeth showing, like he was smiling and chasing his prey. About that time, he leapt towards the truck. Now, I'm doing at least 45 to 50 miles per hour, and it looked like he was about to jump right on the truck. But he missed it, and he hit the other side of the road. Instantly, though, it jumped back on its hind legs, and back onto the road, and chased me for about another 10 seconds or so, and then it just stopped. I never stopped, though. I just kept going, speeding down the road until I could get the truck about 30 miles away. When I got there, I found a place to park and jumped in the back. My mind wouldn't rest, though. It was trying to tell me that this was not real and that it didn't just happen. But it did just happen, and it was real. I just grabbed my dog and snuggled up with him the rest of the night. I managed to fall asleep, but all I could think about and dream about was that werewolf, and that it might have been my last night alive. I kept this a secret from everyone, including my mom and my wife, for a very long time. And when I finally told them, it was like this weight had been lifted. They both cried because they knew that very well might have been my last night alive, and they were definitely happy that it wasn't. So, be careful out there in this world. These creatures are out there. Some mean you harm, and some don't. Just don't ever go looking for them. And if you do cross paths with them, just be careful. Really, really careful. And always be on alert. I know so many people may doubt this story, but it's my true story, believe it or not. It doesn't matter to me. I just want you guys out there to always stay safe and alert. Bear with me. This happened a long, long time ago, so the specifics of the when and where have kind of escaped me. But the rest of what I saw is something that I can never forget, even almost 40 years ago. For the longest time, I had no words for this thing other than werewolf, even though what I saw was in the middle of the day. And for years, I only told a couple people because I didn't want anyone to think that I was a kook. I told my friend that was there about what happened. I think this thing was actually chasing him when it all went down. He didn't really seem to believe me. He thought it had to be something else. Anything else, really. Because werewolves don't exist, right? Well, my friend, if this makes it to your channel, and there's anyone that agrees that they don't exist, they're wrong. Plain and simple. They are dead wrong. I saw one. I know what I saw. I know it wasn't anything else but a werewolf, or at least something similar in appearance. So let me set the stage for you, and I'll do that as best as I can remember. I'd call on my friend Billy, who was the other person there at the time, but sadly, cancer took him several years ago. So the details that I can give you are the only ones that I myself can remember. My mind isn't what it used to be. Maybe I remember what this thing looked like and what it was doing so vividly that I forgot the more insignificant parts. I'm pretty sure that it was in 1983. I know it was summertime, August if I'm not mistaken. So that would put me at 25 years old, if that's the right year. I know it was before either of us met our ladies, so everything before that is kind of hard to keep track of, and honestly, it doesn't really matter what happened before meeting them. I know it happened in Ohio, but for the life of me, I can't remember which part. I wasn't from that area. We were just passing through on our way to a weekend show for classic cars. My cousin Jim had told me about it. He knew that both myself and Billy were very proud of our rides and figured we'd jump at the chance to show them off. Plus, I hadn't been to visit Jim in a good long while, So Billy and I packed up for the adventure and set out for a good time. We were both living in Kendallville, Indiana at the time, and we were driving to Pittsburgh for the show. So it was going to be a long drive, but we were up for the road trip. I just wish we hadn't picked that damn road to drive down when all this happened. Still, I guess it opened my eyes to what could really be out there, and we both made it out alive, so it could be worse. I was driving my 1953 Chevy Bel Air. That I remember clearly. She was beautiful. Billy was driving his 1965 F100, and he was in front of me. Wherever we were looked like just a back road that takes you away from civilization. One of those roads where you only see another car every so often. We hadn't seen another soul for miles, and honestly, I was getting a little bored and kind of antsy. We'd been on the road all day long, and I just wanted to get to our destination already, even though I knew that we weren't going to be in Pittsburgh that day. We still had a few hours worth of driving to get to where we were going for the night, and Billy was just cruising along, going slower than I would like. But if I was in front, I'd be going faster than he'd like, so he insisted that he lead. Where we were at was in the middle of this cornfield. I remember the corn on both sides of the road. Very Texas chainsaw, if you ask me. I didn't get out to see clearly, but the corn itself looked taller than me, and I come in at 6'1", so I put the corn at least 7 feet tall. Who knows, might have even been taller than that. That's why I was bored, you see, because nothing but corn as far as the eye could see. I think I was even just zoning out and just focusing on the road lines. And then, out of the blue, I realized that something was running through the corn. It was in between Billy and myself, and it looked like it was chasing after his truck. I was intrigued. It looked big and upright, so I knew it wasn't some kind of animal. And honestly, I wasn't even sure what kind of animals were in Ohio, if I was being completely honest. We were from Indiana, remember, and just passing through. So, I just watched what I thought was a very large man chasing after Billy's truck. Now keep in mind, this thing was still in the corn all the while, so seeing the details was hard to do. I thought to myself that this guy was very, very fast because we were going about 40 miles per hour or so. Like I said, Billy was going slower than I would be. Still though, you show me any man that can keep pace at 40 miles per hour. That's just not going to happen. There wasn't anything else to do but watch the situation unfold. So I just drove along, keeping an eye on the road and the other on my mystery creature over there. The more I watched, though, the more unnerved I started to feel. And I couldn't explain it. I just felt like something was wrong or something bad was going to happen. And then this stone-cold dread came over my entire body. I remember feeling the chills and my stomach falling, my heart picking up pace. I kept looking over at this thing, and eventually I started to get little peeks of what this thing actually looked like. And when I started putting the details together, I damn near shit myself. Like I said, my initial belief was that I was staring at an honest-to-God werewolf. This creature was too big and too fast to be a person. And I realized that I could see the top of its head bobbing through the top of the corn every now and then. That would put it at least 7 feet tall. And what I was seeing on the top of the corn looked like ears. Like canine ears. I tried to keep pace with this thing as best as I could without tailgating Billy. I wanted to get a better look at it, but I was afraid that if I did start tailgating, that he'd pull over and ask me what my problem was. And stopping right now in the middle of nowhere with some kind of beast on our tail was the last thing that I wanted to happen. I didn't want this thing to run into us without the safety of our vehicles. But I kept looking over, getting as much detail as I could. And here's what I remember. It looked like a damn wolf running on 2 legs. It was covered in dark hair. I'm not sure if it was black or brown, or even if it was just the shadows of the corn that made it seem darker. But I knew that it was covered in hair from the top of its head all the way down to its feet. I know it had a canine muzzle because I could see glances of it as it passed through the stalks of corn. and it moved its arms back and forth like a man when it ran, bent at the elbows, swaying to and fro, front to back. The strides that this thing took were incredible. I mean, it was sprinting at 40 miles per hour, and it made it look easy. It was also very large, as in muscular. Even in the corn stalks, I could appreciate that. With your series of questions that you sent me, you asked me for details like eye color, whether or not it had a tail, and how it stood on its feet. But, unfortunately, the corn made a lot of those details obscured. At one point, though, I do believe that it looked over at me, like it was curious, or angry even, or maybe even sizing me up, as if to chase me instead of Billy. I just know that at the point where I feel it looked at me, it looked directly at me, like through my window, and made eye contact. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt that this thing could see mine, if that makes any sense at all. And that's when I started to absolutely panic. I got this feeling that if we didn't get out of there fast, our lives would be in danger. This thing just gave the overall impression of being completely lethal. It was an apex predator for sure. It looked like it was built for killing, and I don't think that an upright canine running through a cornfield in the middle of nowhere was just doing it for kicks. I remember wondering where the hell this thing could have come from. I asked myself what could even stop it if it decided to attack. These were thoughts that I needed to know because all I could do was watch. I felt absolutely helpless there in my car as this thing just kept speed with us. I needed to get out of there because as far as I knew, Billy wasn't even aware of this thing, so I felt responsible for my life and his. If I honked, he might stop, thinking that something was wrong with the Chevy. If we stopped, I was sure it would kill us both. At this point, it'd been over 2 miles, and it maintained this chase. As far as I know, nothing else can do that, at that speed, for that amount of time. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think anything on this earth has the capability of doing that. I was already convinced it was a werewolf at this point, and I wasn't going to do anything that might cause us to die at the hands of this thing. I could still see it keeping up with us, not giving any indication that it was getting tired. And then I guess I kind of stopped paying attention to it because I was more focused on how to get us out of there. But I did keep glancing over at it, and it stayed with us the whole time. Then I finally figured out what I could do to get him moving faster. I made sure that nobody else was coming on the opposite side of the road. I guess that was the one nice thing about being out there. You could see for miles. When I was sure that nobody was coming down the road the other way, I swerved over and sped up, pulling up to Billy's window. I started waving frantically and motioning for him to get going and not to stop. I was trying my best to make motions with my hands that could be interpreted as "we need to get the hell out of there." I was trying my best to make sure he knew how important it was to listen to me. I think he saw how afraid I was, and maybe that's what kicked him into gear. Because lucky, he got the idea and sped up his truck. I slowed back down a little and went back to driving behind him. For a minute, I thought this thing was going to keep up with us, because as we increased our speed, so did that thing. My heart was beating so fast. I was thinking, how fast can this thing actually move? Are we ever going to be able to lose it? But I guess it was too much for it because it started slowing down, and then it looked like it turned and went further into the corn. And that's when I lost sight of it. I floored the gas to get the hell out of there because Billy was now actually a little further ahead of me. We drove for another good while before we pulled off and back into civilization. I told him everything that I saw, and he just laughed and asked me if I was toking a J in the Chevy while we were cruising back there. I was kind of mad that he didn't believe me. I told him no, I wasn't stoned. I was completely sober during the whole damn incident. He shrugged it off and told me that it had to be something else because there's no such thing as werewolves. We went on our trip and didn't really talk about it much, but it was really weighing on my mind for a long time after that. I talked to him about it for years and years, but I don't know if he ever really believed me. He used to joke about it with me, although he never came out right and told me that he didn't believe me. I guess now I'll never know. God rest his soul. Over the years, I started telling more and more people. I didn't have anything to lose, really, and it happened a really long time ago. I just wish I could remember exactly where it happened so I could give you that location. My name is Jake, and I have a story to tell you about the Dogman. I was actually raised on a story about Dogman too, and I'm going to get my parents to contact you with their story as well. I just didn't want to wait to send this to you after finding your channel. I live in Ohio, and I have always thought of myself as a very down-to-earth person. And honestly, I'm not even sure I believe my parents' story that they would tell me as a kid. The thought of something that walks around on two legs, looking like a werewolf straight out of Hollywood is pretty unbelievable. But trust me, there's something out there like that. This was not a normal wolf, and it was definitely not a bear. A couple things you should know about me for context is that I was raised to be an honest person. I can thank my parents for that. I've never been much of a partier. I've never ever experimented with drugs, and I've only had the occasional drink. I was 19 when this happened. My girlfriend, who was in the car, was the same age, and my little brother was 17. It was January when it happened. It wasn't snowing that particular night. We all saw the same thing. I know a lot of people email you saying they saw something they can't explain. I guess now I'm one of those people. This happened to us near Montgomery County. It wasn't too long of an encounter, but I know exactly what I saw that night. It was Dogman. I know this because of the story that my parents told me that happened before I was born. Like I said, I was raised on that story. Even if I didn't believe them as a teenager, I was scared of those stories as a child. As a boy that had recently graduated high school the June before this happened, and on my way to adulthood, I learned through this experience that my parents were not making it up. If I'd been alone when I saw that thing, I might have had the smallest notion that I imagined it, or that it was a hallucination or a dream. But I wasn't alone. My girlfriend Brienne was there. My brother Ryan was there. They both saw it too. It wasn't even too late at night. Not even 11 o'clock. It was a clear night, so the vision was perfect. None of us had any type of alcohol or drug in our system. We all saw the same thing. We all wrote down what we had experienced when we got back to the house. We all believed it was a Dogman we saw that night. And so this is what happened. The three of us were driving back from seeing a movie, Black Panther, and we were talking on one of the back roads as we drove back. We were headed to my house. Ryan had a curfew since he was still in high school, but he was with us, so it was kind of laxed. Still, we didn't want to take advantage of my parents' rules, so we were going straight home from the movie. I was going slightly over the speed limit, just because I wanted to get Ryan home. I was driving, Brienne was sitting next to me, and Ryan was in the back seat. All of us were wide awake and discussing what we liked about the movie and how we couldn't wait for the next Marvel film to come out. But then, Ryan pointed out of the front window and blurted out, "What in the hell is that?" Our lights bounced off of something, some kind of animal, and we rounded the corner. We got a good look at it. This thing was standing on the side of the road, just at the corner. Still in the grassy area, but almost on the road itself. It was standing on two legs, just like a human. I slowed to barely a crawl, because I was intrigued as to what this creature could be. I shouldn't have done that. I should have just kept going. This thing looked over at us and actually lifted an arm that was ending in a clawed hand to shield its eyes from the light. Before it did that, though, the headlights seemed to reflect in the eyes, giving it that glow of a nocturnal animal. Now, I want to be specific with this because I know a lot of people say that they seem to be glowing themselves, but these eyes definitely just reflected the light of our headlights. And I knew instantly what we were looking at because of that damn story that my parents used to tell me. So did my brother, and he yelled out, "It's the Dogman." I stopped the car because I didn't want to go past it. I didn't turn it off, I left it running obviously, but I didn't want to go past this thing. Brienne was screaming at me to go. Ryan just kept yelling, "It's the Dogman," over and over, pointing and saying, look, it's the Dogman," like I could possibly be focused on anything but the creature that was in front of us. My parents always said that it was huge, but I guess I never appreciated just how big this thing actually was until I saw it for myself. It had to be 7.5 feet tall, at minimum. Brienne thinks the same thing, but Ryan says bigger, maybe even 8.5 feet tall. It was ripped, too. Like a bodybuilder that spent all day, every day, lifting weights, especially the shoulders. It looked capable of carrying off extremely heavy prey, or at least pinning it down and killing it quickly. The quads of this thing were extremely thick and muscular, too, bigger than even a pro wrestler's quads. It was a really dark brown color, like the same coloration of the werewolf in Silver Bullet. In fact, it looked a lot like that werewolf, except way, way bigger. This was definitely not a guy in a suit. It had a long muzzle, like a dog or wolf, and big ears too. The hands on this thing were deadly. I could see the one that it was using to cover its eyes very clearly. It had long, wicked-looking claws that looked like a fingered hand. It wasn't a paw. It was a hand. And those claws looked capable of evisceration. I could see the flesh on the palms. It was also a very dark brown color, but definitely hairless. Also, it was definitely male. I could see the boy parts. But the penis didn't look human. It looked more canine. The Dogman put his hand down after the initial light hit his eyes, and it stared at us. He didn't seem angry or aggressive, but he also didn't seem the least bit scared. It was like it was waiting for us to make a move, so it could decide how to react to it. I remember the sounds of the windows going up distinctly from the passenger seat and the back seat. I rolled mine up too. I really didn't know what to do at that point. I wanted to get out of there, but I also wanted to see this thing, since I'd heard the story of my parents' encounter all my life. Ryan and Brienne were both telling me to go, but I was scared because there was no way I could gain enough speed before we passed that thing. I didn't want it attacking the car, or breaking a window and pulling one of us out. I felt responsible for all three of us. My girlfriend that I needed to protect, and my baby brother, who I had always looked out for. I knew I had to do something though, because we were in the middle of the street and I didn't want anyone to come up behind us and hit our car. So, I decided that maybe flashing my brights might scare it off. So I quickly turned them on and off several times. When I did this, the Dogman threw both hands up to its face to cover its eyes and started shaking its head wildly, like the lights were too bright for his eyes. And I knew then that my idea wasn't exactly the best. I think all I really managed to do was piss it off. It looked at us again, and it let out this roar, or scream, that was so loud we could hear it inside the car with the windows up. I knew I messed up. Brienne started screaming too, and my brother started yelling, "Get out of here! We need to get out of here! The Dogman's gonna get us!" Then, this thing put its hands down and actually charged straight at us. Ryan was screaming at this point to drive. He was hysterical. I slammed my foot on the gas, but like I thought, we didn't build up much speed. It looked like that Dogman was going to plow right into the front of the car. But as it ran by us, it moved to the right at the last second and we sped by it. I was too busy trying to get out of there, but Ryan gave a very good description to me of what happened next. When we passed by it, it spun around to look back at us and roared again. Ryan said the taillights were illuminating it, and the expression on its face was the angriest that he's ever seen. He could see it snarling and saw long teeth that looked just as deadly as the claws. Ryan said it dropped down to all fours and bounded after us for a few leaps, but it stopped almost as soon as it started, like it automatically gave up, or it wasn't interested in us. Then it went back down, like it was doing a push-up motion. But as it came back up, it sprang back on two legs and took off onto the other side of the road. Then he lost sight of it in the darkness. I honestly think that creature was giving us a bluff charge to get us the hell out of there. It's like we couldn't decide what to do, so he decided what we should do for us. Believe me, it worked. We got out of there. The whole way back to our house, all three of us were talking over each other, trying to discuss what we had just seen. I was still so nervous that I was shaking, and my hands were freezing. I really thought that I was going to throw up at that point too. But what I can remember the most about that part is how cold my fingers were. I don't know why I remember that so vividly, but because it was so vivid, I just figured I'd throw that in there too. Maybe so you guys could feel how scared I was. Ryan was just yammering about seeing a werewolf and that our parents were telling the truth our whole lives. He was talking about what the odds could be that us seeing one was the same one that my parents saw. I have to admit, that thought crossed my mind too, especially when it was right there. I wasn't sure though, since they'd seen it hours away from where we saw it, and it was before I was even born. So that thing must have been really old. But I wasn't ruling out the possibility that it was the same creature. My girlfriend, my poor Brienne, looked like she was on the verge of tears, and she wouldn't let go of my hand. She was dumbfounded that my parents were telling the truth too. I mean, of course I had told her the story about 100 times, that they claimed that they saw some type of werewolf creature way back in the day, but I don't think that she believed them either. I guess she was just as skeptical as I was, but none of us were skeptics anymore after that. We all saw the same damn thing as my parents did. When we got home, we immediately told my parents that we saw the same type of creature that they saw. They shrugged and said it was a dogman, and then they sat us down and we all just talked about what we felt about it. Terrified mostly. That was the general feeling between the three of us. Terror. My parents were understanding. We described what it looked like, hoping that it might be the same one, but the color didn't match. I'll let them tell you all about what they saw when they contact you. My fear, though, is that Ohio has several of these things running around. Maybe even a breeding population. And the reason I think this is because this happened more than 20 years after my parents' encounter. This thing that we saw didn't look old. It didn't look the way that a dog or a wolf does when they're aging. But then I thought to myself, who knows how long these things live? And so I ask you, exactly how long are these lives capable of for these creatures? When I was a kid, we had this big lab mix that we had to put to sleep when he was 14 years old. And the vet told us that he was really old for a dog. I mean, unless these things live longer, which I'm not saying it's not a probability, I really don't think that it was the same one. Especially when you throw in the fact that the coat wasn't the same color either. It scares me to think of what's out there. How many of these things are running around Ohio? How many of these things are running around the United States? All I know is I no longer think my parents were telling us a story of the Dogman just to keep us in line. They were telling us the truth. Okay, this happened to me last year in Ohio, and I still have so many questions about it. I still have a hard time coming to grips with it and accepting that monsters really are real, and that I saw one firsthand. So bear with me here, please. I guess I should start by telling you about myself. My name is Wendy, and I'm 18 years old. I was 17 when this sighting happened, though. I'm a pretty shy person, not your stereotypical teenager. I like to be by myself and explore over going to parties and flirting with boys. I guess that was what started my troubles. I was out by myself when this happened. I'm also using my talk-to-text app, so if this sounds really informal, that's why. Anyways, like I said, this happened in Ohio. I'd rather not say the exact location, but if you really want to know, I think I can trust you to keep it a secret. But I guess to describe where I live, I actually have to tell you that I live on the eastern part of the state, and I live really close to the Appalachian Mountains. I was out in the woods when this happened to me. It changed my life because now I know what's really out there. It was a Saturday, around this time of the year actually, May 23rd. Because of all the COVID-19 stuff going on, I would just spend my weekends walking around the forested areas and exploring. There really wasn't much else I could do anyways, with the world shut down and all. I'd come across this big man-made box up in a tree on a hike a few times before this. I guess it was a deer blind. Basically, it looked like a big wooden box with one side missing and a window cut in the other 3 sides. It was accessible from a ladder that also looked very man-made. Basically, 2x4s nailed together to form this makeshift ladder. And I thought it was neat, and I had climbed up there the first time I saw it. This time though, I had a backpack with me with some snacks, water, and the book I was reading at the time. It was 4 Past Midnight by Stephen King. I was reading the library policeman portion when this happened. That's not too important to know, but if I was listening to somebody tell me this story, I'd be curious. So I climbed up into the blind to read some of the book and just forget about how weird the world was lately. At this time, there were a lot of people that thought this was Armageddon or some shit like that. I just wanted to feel carefree for a while, but I guess it didn't really happen that way. I'd been up there for a while and actually read a lot, and I was really into it, so I have no idea just how long I was up there. But I remember hearing this weird sound. It was like a deep growl, but it didn't exactly sound close. It sounded far off, which was weird to me because it sounded so loud. After that, I set my book down and listened for it again, and that's when I realized how freaking quiet it was around me. It was like I was actually inside the library. There were no animals making any kind of sound at all. And then I started hearing this crunch, crunch, crunch noise coming from the woods, and I started freaking out. My first thought was it was the guy that owned the blind, and I was in deep shit, or it was some other person, and I really didn't want to have a run-in with some stranger. I mean, I'm a teenage girl that's 5'2", can barely defend herself, and weighs about 110 pounds. Only, it wasn't some guy that walked out of the woods. And in retrospect, I think a guy walking out of the woods would have been the least of my concerns. This was something, not someone. I barely noticed it at first because it was moving so slowly, and it was really well hidden for as big as this thing turned out to be. When I first saw it, it was just peeking around the corner of this tree, and I was just peeking out around the window. So I don't think it saw me, but luckily I saw it. Now, I fully believe it not only knew that I was there, but it had smelled me or sensed me way before that. And I think that's why it was moving really cautiously at first. But when it came out into the open, I saw its whole body, and I actually had to cover my mouth to keep from screaming. For lack of a better term, even though I'm sure everyone listening knows exactly what a dogman is, what I was looking at looked like your classic effing werewolf. I mean, the head looked like a wolf, but a monster wolf, something from a scary movie. Its head was really big. The muzzle was super long, and the ears stuck straight up out into the air. I could even see the skin on the front of the ear, where there wasn't fur. It had a big, wet, black nose, and it kept sniffing the air with it. It was looking around every couple of seconds, and would open its big-ass mouth, and I could see all these terrible, horrible teeth. I could also hear it breathing. Of course, it was standing on 2 legs, and those legs were like a gym addict, kind of muscular. It stood like a dog, on its toes, and the fur on its legs was shaggy and kind of matted, like it was losing its coat or shedding or something. The waist and torso looked stretched out to me, like longer than a human's, but maybe not for this creature. The proportions just didn't make sense to me though. The whole coat was gray and brown and tan. It looked like the colors were made to blend into the woods, which I can tell you, it really did blend in. By now, I'm so scared, I feel like puking, crying, and screaming for my mommy. If you've never felt fear like that, you're lucky. It was like unbearable how scary it really was. And it only got scarier because this thing walked right under the tree and right under the blind and started growling again. Then making this weird, almost whining noise. But the whine was also mixed in with the growl. And it was so loud, I could actually feel it, and I was shaking from it. Not just because I was scared, but because it felt like my insides were vibrating. Then the freaking blind started shaking, like this thing was trying to tear the whole tree down. At this point, I'm screaming. I'm not even stifling myself anymore. I knew that it knew I was there, and so I was not being quiet. I'm trying to be as loud as possible to scare this thing away. And then I hear these snapping noises and think the blind is starting to give. But it turns out later that this werewolf thing was ripping the steps off of the ladder. Now you have to realize, I think I'm dead at this point. I just knew that that thing was going to pull me down, destroy the blind, and eat me. It's growling and grunting. I'm screaming for help, not even trying to scare it away at this point now. Just screaming and hoping somebody hears me to come help me. The noises that this thing was making were out of this world. Crazy, primal noises, like it wanted me and it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I actually peed. I was so scared. Then everything stopped and I held my breath. I guess I was just waiting for it to attack again. When it didn't attack, I peeked out of the window and saw it standing there, just staring up at me, like it was trying to figure out how to get to me. And I saw an intelligence in those eyes that I haven't even seen in the primates that I see at the zoo. I screamed again, also crying my eyes out. I was trapped. I had nowhere to go, and that thing was waiting for me to come down, or trying to figure out how to get to me. Either way, I thought I was toast. Then it started grunting again. It almost sounded like grunts that cavemen make in those movies. That's what I describe it as, at least. There were these spots on the floor of the blind that I could look through and saw it moving back and forth under there, just pacing and looking up. It had such a human quality that it was just surreal to me. I had the feeling that it was frustrated that it couldn't get to me. It let out a couple of barks and then got down on four legs and ran around the tree a couple of times, barking and yipping. I started screaming again, but then it stopped and looked up at me on the other side that didn't have the wall. And it actually cocked its head like a person would do, and huffed, like a frustrated, I give up huff. And then it ran off while it was still on four legs. I got the hell out of there too, in the other direction, which was not in the direction of my house. But I needed to get out of that tree, and I needed to get out of the forest, and I was out in the open, so I could get the hell out of there. When I went to go down is when I noticed the steps were ripped off. The ladder was a mess, and I ended up having to jump a few feet down. And let me tell you, it's a good thing that I like track and field, because I tore out of there as fast as I could, and I didn't stop to take a breather. Not until I was out of the forest and knew that I was safe. I left my backpack and my book and everything else there. I don't know how far up in the tree the blind actually was, but when I jumped, the steps were broken over my head, so this thing could reach up at least 6 or 7 feet, but I think it was even taller than that. It had to weigh a couple of 100 pounds too, maybe even more. I can't really describe the size of this thing, but it just looked massive. I made it home though, and I cried the whole way back and kept looking around to see if it was chasing me, but I made it home. I didn't tell anyone for a really long time and had trouble sleeping for months after that. I would actually stay up most of the night and sleep during the day, which my schedule allowed me since it was distance learning and everybody knows that was a joke. And then it was summertime, so I didn't have school. I never will go back there. I have no intention of ever going into that area of the forest ever again. Not even to show my friends where it happened. And I told every one of the people that I share my story with that if I find out they went looking for this thing, I'd be really, really upset and maybe not even talk to them again. I don't want anything happening to anyone because of me. I know it wasn't a werewolf that I saw. I know it was a dogman. It was daytime. I mean, werewolves only come out at night, right? People I tell say that I'm crazy for believing in all of these things, but if this thing is out there, then other things have to be too. Anyways, thank you for listening, and hopefully this will make it on your channel. I think you do really good work sharing the truth and letting people tell their stories for others to believe too. The woods scare me now. I don't ever want to go back in them unless I have to. It sucks, but that's the reality. What are you gonna do, right? I still haven't even finished 4 Past Midnight. Just reading any part of it sends me right back to that day. I just can't do it. I know a lot of people out there, especially a lot of people that listen to these types of stories on YouTube, want to go out and find this thing. But I'd really suggest otherwise. And it's my advice to stay away from these things, because even though I got away, it doesn't mean other people will too. And in fact, a lot of the missing persons around the woods could be because of something like this. I hope you have a good day. Thanks again for sharing my story. Sincerely, Wendy. This happened last year in Ohio. We live pretty far out in the cuts, and there's a lot of forest area around us. I think that's why this creature was snooping around our place. It came from the forest. It was a typical Saturday night. My friends Carl and Nick were over, and we were playing Halo. Usually, my parents would go out for the evening to have a date night, and us guys would stay at our house and play video games. All 3 of us were 16, so we were old enough to stay by ourselves. Our dog was also hanging out with us. She's a husky collie mix named Caroline, like the Neil Diamond song. In fact, we usually call her Sweet Caroline. It was around 10:30 or so, and we were taking a break and eating some pizza, just laughing and having a good time. I was thirsty, so I got up to get a water, and Carl and Nick asked to get one for them too, so I said I would. When I got up, so did Caroline. She usually follows me everywhere I go. She was kind of whiny about it though, so I figured she had to go outside, which I'd let her out after I got the water, since the door to the backyard was on the opposite side of the house. As soon as I went through the swinging door of the kitchen though, I had this feeling like I shouldn't be there. I think it was my body telling me that I was in danger. I heard this low growling noise and looked at the window that was above the sink. I couldn't help but yell out in fright, because there was this thing in the window that looked just like a werewolf. The head and arm were in the window, and the screen was missing. Caroline started barking like crazy, and this thing let out this growl that was so intense that I flew back through the door yelling like an idiot to my friends that there was a werewolf trying to get into the window. Of course, they didn't believe me for a second, but I screamed at them, swearing words that I shouldn't say, and told them that I wasn't lying. This thing was dark brown with a long muzzle and a black nose on the end. It had skinny ears that started on the sides of its head, and it had tufts of hair on the top. The tufts were the same color as the rest of it. It had yellow eyes like a cat, but they really seemed to glow on their own. And it had kind of shaggy hair on the top of its head. When we locked eyes, I felt like I was going to die. It looked very angry, and when it growled, it also lifted up its lips to reveal a row of really long, sharp teeth. The arm that was inside and through the window had shorter hair than the head, but the exact same color. It was really long, longer than I think an arm should be. The really messed up part though, was that it actually had hands and fingers that looked almost human. It was in no way a paw that I was looking at. And I think this creature was trying to fit through the window, or at least grab something that it had smelled after it got to our home and ripped the screen off of the window. But anyways, Carl and Nick both get up and go into the kitchen. Caroline was still there, going nuts, but that thing wasn't at the window anymore. But it was only a couple seconds later that we believe it ran past the other window in the kitchen, and it was big enough to convince both of them that something was outside. even though whatever it was outside was moving too fast for any of us to get a good look at it. And also, it seemed to me like it was running on 2 legs because it was so tall. It actually looked taller than the window, which would make it at least 7 feet tall. Both of my friends freaked out, and I told them that I wasn't lying, and that it went in the direction of the backyard, so it probably ran around the corner of the house. Like idiots, we ran to the backyard to see if we could see it, even though there was part of my brain saying that it could be running to the door to the backyard, trying to get into the house. And even though I felt this dread again, I guess I was still curious or something. Maybe I'm just dumb. So we open the back door and look, and sure enough, there's that werewolf thing at the back of the backyard, standing by our gate. That's when all 3 of us got a really good look at this thing. It was so big, so huge, it looked like it would put any bodybuilder to shame. It was taller than our 7-foot fence. Its head and shoulders cleared the top of the fence, and it was standing on 2 legs. It looked like it was standing on its toes or something, kind of like Caroline does when she walks around. And it had those pointed things sticking out the back of the back legs. The whole body was dark brown, just like the head, and the fur on its chest area was a lot longer than the rest of its body, even the shaggy portion on the top of its head. It really looked to me like it was built of pure muscle. Every part of it was just enormous. The arms were muscular, the shoulders were muscular, the neck, the thighs, even the bottom of the legs. Just all muscle. It was the most intimidating thing that I'd ever seen in my entire life. It almost looked like that werewolf from Van Helsing when the guy turns into it in the building, but bigger and more intimidating. Same basic shape though. Carl and Nick started swearing and yelling, and I think they were both in shock. The werewolf, or I guess it could be a dogman or whatever it was, stared at us for just a second or two, and then snarled in our direction, just like it did when its head was inside my window. The look that this thing was giving us made me realize how intelligent it just might be. And I've seen enough werewolf movies to know that sometimes they can keep their human intelligence. I know it sounds dumb to compare real life to a movie, but I really think that sometimes these writers in Hollywood make movies out of their own experiences and just never tell anyone about them. I think that could actually be it. How some people get what I saw and all the details just right. At this point, I'm panicked. So are my friends. Caroline is more protective and aggressive than I've ever seen her. She was barking and snarling, and then she bolted past us and took off in the direction that thing was standing. Now I'm screaming at her to get back because I know she's gonna die if they fight each other. That thing looked like it was made to rip things apart. And then something even crazier than seeing a werewolf in your own backyard happened. This thing actually used the door handle on the gate to open it. The door clicks shut when it's closed. You can tell that it's closed, and it swings into the backyard, not out into the trees and the fields behind us. This thing used the handle and the door like it knew what it was. That's when I realized that it really was that intelligent, and that maybe it was hunting us the entire time. It slipped out of the backyard and ran off into the woods behind our house, and Caroline kept running after the damn thing though. It darted out of the gate, and she darted with it. I knew I shouldn't have, and I do realize how dumb of an idea it was, even now. But I ran after her. She was my dog. I loved her. I wasn't about to let her get ripped apart by this creature if I could do anything to stop it. I ran after her, screaming for her to come back. Nick and Carl actually followed me, screaming at me to come back, because they didn't want me going off alone into the woods after a werewolf and my dog. They'd seen the creature too. Now that's a good friend if you ask me. These guys had no idea where that thing was or what it was capable of. But they saw what I did, and they could use their imaginations just as well as I could. They knew that thing could rip us apart easily, one after the other, and not even break a sweat. But still, my two best friends in the entire world ran off after me into the dark woods to help find my dog. But before we could even get out of the backyard, we hear this commotion on the other side of the fence. I have no idea what happened in the time it took us to get to that gate, but I know I have never heard anything scream like that in my entire life. It wasn't a scared scream. It was almost a battle scream or something, like that thing was in a fight. The noise actually made me stop running for a minute because I was so scared. It was just so bad. I heard Caroline going nuts. I heard her barking and yipping, and then I heard her yelping and more of those screams, and more barks. But what also sounded like a cross between a grunt and a roar, so I think Caroline got in a couple good licks too. When we made it to the back gate, I realized something else. It was pitch black out there. We had no lights, anything like that. Not even our phones to use the flashlight on our phone. I've never felt fear like that. I couldn't see anything. The woods were dead silent, and I knew there was a monster out there. The only thing I could actually hear was the beating of my own heart and the breathing of Nick and Carl behind me. I also had no idea where my dog was. And then we heard movement, and my heart stopped beating. I thought that thing was coming for us, but luckily, it was just Caroline. She was limping really badly, and even in what little light there was, I could see her limp, and I could see that she was covered in something dark. That turned out to be her own blood. I picked her up, and I ran back to the house with Carl and Nick as fast as I could. And I want to point this out. I want to thank my adrenaline, because that dog is about 70 pounds, give or take. But I picked her up and ran back home like she weighed nothing at all. We slammed the door and locked it, and I started looking over Caroline. She had some really bad wounds on her side. They looked like claw marks to me, and she wouldn't put any pressure on her front left leg. But she was still wagging her tail and licking me, so I knew that it wasn't seriously life-threatening, but it probably hurt really bad. We ended up calling my mom and dad and telling them that Caroline got into a fight with something, and we needed their help. We took her to the vet, and she had to have surgery to repair the wounds on her. I guess they were so bad she had to get put under anesthesia or something like that. The vet asked what attacked her, since she'd never seen wounds like that before, but the three of us said we didn't know. Her leg turned out to be fine, and turned out to be what our vet called a soft tissue injury that would eventually go away on its own. We got to take her home the next day, and they told us how to take care of her while she was healing. She had to have some stitches in her gash, and she had to take a few different medicines for pain and to make sure it didn't get infected. She also had to wear one of those cones until she was healed. I think that's the part that she actually hated the most. That cone. The next day, my dad had to fix the screen on the window too. It looked like something ripped it right off of the kitchen wall, and it was so bent and torn, he actually had to buy a new one and fix the window frame before he could even attach the screen to the frame. He was convinced that it was a bear that was responsible for the window and for hurting Caroline. I still haven't told my parents what actually attacked her, or that that thing was trying to get into the house. But I have spent so many nights just lying awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling and getting nervous at any little sound, going around and looking out the windows, making sure that that thing wasn't there. Caroline, though, made a complete recovery and refused to leave my side like always, especially when we were outside, which didn't help my nerves at all. As far as I know, that thing hasn't come back in over a year. Hopefully it doesn't at all. I plan on telling my parents, though. I want to tell them the truth about what happened that night, especially since I'll be going to college in the not-too-distant future. They should probably know what's out there in the forest. I just hope they believe me. I think I might actually have Nick and Carl there when I tell them, or at least have them talk to them too and tell them their experience. I was thinking about maybe doing it separately, so they realize we all saw the same thing because of our descriptions of it. If we all have the same details of what we saw, they have to believe us, right? What I want to know, though, is why that thing was halfway in the window when I walked into the room. If I hadn't, would it have figured out a way to get in? I don't think that window was big enough for its entire body to fit through. Maybe it was just trying to get something there in the kitchen. There was some pizza on the counter and some fruit, but I don't think that thing likes to eat fruit or pizza. Maybe it was trying to get in. That way it could kill us all in the sneak attack. I can imagine my parents' faces now if they came home and saw all three of us and Caroline ripped apart all over the living room. Sometimes I think I hear howling at night off in the forest by our house, but I think it might just be my imagination. Still though, those are the nights that I make sure that all the doors and windows are locked. And those are the nights that Caroline actually gets a little antsy, which again, doesn't help my anxiety. I know my dad has a few rifles and handguns in the house, but honestly, I don't think anything that he owns would stop that creature. I know a lot of other people have seen this creature, and I am familiar with the Germantown werewolf. Hopefully, it's not the same thing. But on one hand, I kind of hope it is the same thing, because if there's other things out there that are similar, either a dogman or a werewolf, what's to say that everything else that we think is under our bed isn't really? I want to thank you for taking the time to read this, and I hope all of your subscribers enjoy my story. Even though it was a terrifying experience, it still makes for one hell of a campfire story. Have a good night, Supernaturalist, and all of you creatures of the night. To whom it may concern, I am writing this to you because I saw something 7 years ago that still haunts me to this day. The only thing I can describe it as is a real, physical werewolf. I know it sounds crazy, but here on YouTube there are lots of encounters like this. I am not crazy. I was not and have never been on drugs, and I know what I saw. I never believed in these types of things before my encounter, and it's raised several questions in my faith since then. I'd like to keep this a private location, so I'll be as vague as possible, and I'll be changing the names of the people involved, and I won't be giving any specific locations. Just know that it happened in Ohio 7 years ago, and I was not the only one to see this thing. For a little bit of backstory, my friend David and myself worked a late shift at a local restaurant, and we typically didn't get out of the building until after midnight. We were both working the bar lately, so getting out early was not really a possibility. I was a 24-year-old woman back then. David was older than me by 6 months. Neither of us had really been anywhere outside of Ohio. Neither of us had any experience with the supernatural either. On the night of our encounter, we were leaving just like normal. The staff was supposed to park around the back of the building in the private parking area, so that's where both of our cars were. We said goodbye to the co-workers that were still there doing their side work. We'd gotten to the routine of David walking me to my car since it was late, and I'm a girl. So we headed to my car first, which was a few spots down from the garbage area. As we were walking to my car, we started hearing the sounds of something moving around in the garbage. It was one of those concrete areas that had several garbages from the restaurant and the other businesses that shared the strip. At first, we thought it was someone throwing garbage away, but it occurred to me that it actually sounded like someone was moving stuff around inside one of the containers. Maybe it was a homeless person. It's happened before. They're just hungry and looking for something to eat. I thought about slowly going over there and making myself known, asking if they needed food, because I could probably just go back into the restaurant and get them something, so they didn't have to dig around in the trash. But then these weird grunting noises started coming from the garbage too, and they absolutely did not sound human to me. They sounded like a very large animal, so I started thinking it was a bear. Bears can be a problem at this time of year. You don't see them often, but every couple years we seem to have a problem bear around here. Usually it turns out to be a young male that ventures into the area and the wildlife officials have to trank them and move them out. Whatever was in there really stank too. It wasn't the trash I was smelling. I can tell the difference. This smelled like very strong pee and dirty animal. I decided at that point to just walk to my car and get out of there. There was no reason to disturb the bear, and I didn't really want to be attacked. Obviously, this thing was hungry, and I didn't want to end up a meal. But then, David grabbed my arm and stopped me, giving me this look that meant we needed to be quiet. And he started pulling me back the way we came, back towards the restaurant. And he had this look on his face that was pure dread. His eyes were huge. Now, the thing you have to know is, I trusted David. I'd known him for a lot of years. We went to high school together, so I didn't ask questions. I just followed his lead. We didn't turn around to go back. We walked backwards, keeping our eyes on the garbage, and those weird grunting noises kept going, and they were getting louder, like this thing was getting excited. The digging sound stopped, and I half expected a bear to climb over the wall. But what I saw next was something I can never unsee. The door to the garbage area was slightly open, and I saw something peeking out of it at the very top, slowly and cautiously. It was definitely the muzzle of an animal, but it was too long to be a bear. The muzzle looked very canine to me. Then the door pushed open, and a second or two later, this wolf on 2 legs walked out. It just stood there, on 2 legs, looking around, while we hid around the corner of the building, watching this thing. And the only thing I could think was it was a werewolf. I was actually looking at a real werewolf. Now you asked me for a description, so here goes. It looked taller than David, but shorter than the garbage area, so I'd put it around 7 feet tall or so. Way too tall to be a person, and it definitely wasn't a person in the costume, because I could see the muzzle moving and the eyes blinking. The lighting in the parking lot made the fur seem a medium brown color, but there were also different colors mixed in, like gray and black. The arms were skinny, but very long, and it definitely had claws on the hands, and fingers, not paws. It looked like it stood like a dog, reared up on its toes. The legs were skinny and long too, and kind of bent at the knees, giving this creature kind of a hunched position. I've listened to a lot of encounters lately about something called a dogman and how massive they look, but this thing didn't look like that. It was skinny, almost emaciated. Sure, the legs and the arms, especially the bicep area, had muscles, but nothing like these dogmen are described as. And the stomach area was very sunken in. It looked almost malnourished. The head on this thing, though, looked like a werewolf, like some nightmare version of a real wolf. It was big and had a long snout. I couldn't see any teeth, though, even when this thing started growling at us. I think we were just too far away for that detail, and I'm sorry, but I don't know what color its eyes were. It had long ears that I could see, though, and they came from the sides of its head, and they looked almost like how a Doberman Pinscher's ears are after they're cropped. I'm also 100% certain that it had a tail. I saw this when it was running to the fence. It reminded me of a German Shepherd's tail, long and bushy. If I had to describe it as any of the werewolves that I've seen in the movies that I've watched, then I would say The Howling. It definitely looked like one of the werewolves from The Howling. When it was out of that garbage area, it looked like it was surveying the area that was around it. Maybe it was making sure nobody was there, or making sure there wasn't a threat or something. I could see its chest going in and out as it was breathing. Then it started sniffing the air, and holding its nose up in the air and sniffing around like that. Then it started doing this weird heaving motion, which sounded like a cross between a laugh and a grunt. Honestly, when that thing started making those noises, it scared the hell out of me. And I think at that point, it smelled us, and it was reacting to our scent because it looked right in our direction. Opened its mouth and growled. And the growl was just so deep and disturbing. When it did that, I started to cry. But still, this thing didn't come towards us, though. Instead, it looked over at this fence that separates our parking lot from an empty field, looked back in our direction, and ran over to that fence. When it did that, it was still on 2 legs. What kind of animal can run like that so gracefully on 2 legs? And the distance between steps was enormous. It only took about 4 or 5 steps total before it got to the fence and leapt completely over it. It cleared that fence with no problem. Later, when we measured it, it was the same height as the garbage container, 8 feet tall. This thing leapt completely over it. When it did it, it brushed through the trees that are on our side of the fence, and I could see the branches moving back and forth and the leaves falling from them. Both of us ran back to the restaurant and burst in the door, and luckily there were still a couple of closers there that hadn't finished up yet. We were panicked and sweating, shaking because we were so scared, and both trying to talk at the same time. We explained what we saw, and of course everyone thought that it was a prank, but I started crying again. They started to believe that we'd actually seen something, although they weren't going to say that it was a werewolf, and they actually wanted to go out and investigate. I was absolutely against that idea, but David reminded me that all our cars were back there anyway, and we'd have to go there eventually. I guess it was better to go with a group of people. So we helped finish their side work so we could get out of there faster, and then we all left together. I was trying to tell everyone that this was exactly how scary movies start, but they were more amused and curious to see what was going on than worried that they were going to get attacked by a werewolf. They didn't see what I saw. Maybe if they did, they wouldn't be so curious. We ended up staying out there for about 10 to 15 minutes or so, but we didn't find anything that pointed to a werewolf that was walking around. The trash was all over the inside of that area, though. It was a horrible mess, and it still had this pungent odor. Even one of the other girls that worked there said that that didn't smell like the garbage. It smelled like wild animal. A couple of the guys, including David, looked over the fence but couldn't see anything. I was sure that that thing was going to pop up and rip one of their heads off. But here's what really freaked us out, and it actually called off their stupid investigation. There was a sound of a howl from somewhere past the field that it ran off into. It was loud, even for the distance that it was at. And I know it sounds cliche and all, but that really got everyone moving to their cars. After that night, I was scared to walk back to my car and started parking as far away from the garbage as possible. Even if that meant parking down at the other end of the strip and walking past the front of the businesses to get to my car, which was a long way out of my way. A couple of the guys we worked with just teased us about it. They weren't mean, it was all in good fun, but they kept talking about Helen's werewolf, like it was mine or something. I just smiled and kept telling them they wouldn't think it was so funny if they saw it too. And even though everybody went out there occasionally to take a look and see if that thing was around, none of us ever saw it again. I stayed at that restaurant for another 1.5 years before I got a different job, and there was never any trace of it. I'm still really good friends with David, and when our families get together for dinners or barbecues, we naturally discuss the werewolf. My husband thinks it's fascinating and always tells David they should go out on some werewolf hunt or some twisted investigation to see if they can find it. I told him he's never going out there looking for it. Anyways, I think it's long gone now, so they wouldn't find it anyway. That was a long time ago now. I don't know if that thing lived around there or if it just found itself there that night because it was scavenging for food. I think the main reason that it was scavenging in that area for food was because of how emaciated it looked. Like, maybe it wasn't able to hunt, or maybe it was the brunt of the litter. Who knows? I just know that the look of that thing, even as sickly and skinny as it looked, It could still have killed both of us without any problem. And one thing is definitely for certain. It's a story that I will tell for the rest of my life. Good evening, creatures of the night, and hopefully you enjoyed all the Dogman Encounters coming out of Ohio. Next week, fresh episodes. I have Dogman, I have Glitch in the Matrix, I have Skinwalkers. I just haven't had time to go through all of them and ask all the people that have contacted me the questions that I normally ask because I've been concentrating so hard on finishing this novel. Which brings me to why I'm here talking to you right now. It's done. It's published. It's on Amazon. Right now, it's just a digital copy, but the paperback and the hardback are what Amazon calls in review, so hopefully within the next couple of days, those will be available too. I've poured my heart and soul into this book, and I hope that you guys enjoy it as much as I enjoy writing it. Being an author has been my dream since I was little. I remember reading Goosebump books, and then Animorph books, and Stephen King, and Anne Rice, and all of these books that just made me forget about all the troubles that I was having my entire life, and getting wrapped up in these stories, and I just want to be able to say that I've done that for people too. This book is so important to me. I hope that you guys just really delve into it and sink your teeth into it. So, I'm going to present one of the chapters. I'm going to read a little preview. It doesn't spoil the plot. It doesn't do anything that would give away any spoilers, but hopefully it's written well enough and it's interesting enough for you guys to get hooked on it and want to know more about the story. The link to the Amazon account to get that is in the description down below. I hope you guys can get to that and start reading and reach out to me and tell me what you think, because I'm really excited to hear your guys' opinions. You guys have been with me for a very long time. I thank you for running with me for so long and being just as enthusiastic about this novel that I've been. I have a lot of great supporters here, and I hope that I don't let you guys down with this first novel. So, without further ado, here is a chapter to sink your teeth into, and I hope you enjoy the Gryffyn Chronicles, Volume 1, Chosen. Down the shore from the boardwalk, two college students sit and watch the waves crash onto the beach. They're from out of town and spending the last remaining evening in the cove before heading back to the Bay Area. The girl stares out at the ocean and eyes an old abandoned mansion that sits on an island about a mile offshore. The mansion once belonged to the first mayor of October's Cove, Wilkins Groiner. He had it built in 1885 and lived there with his wife until the day they both disappeared. Neither of them were ever found. The authorities assumed that they had drowned in the surf and their bodies were washed out to the bay. No one else ever lived in the house, despite its size and location. There were rumors circulating about opening it as a historical museum, but the funding fell through and it was only partially restored. That was 30 years ago. Now the mansion just sits and rots away on the harsh salt air. But once in a while, the ghost stories surface again. Stories of lights and sounds coming from the Groiner mansion. But those stories have been disputed by Sheriff Barr and Deputy Tonks, especially after the disappearances last summer. It seems every year people go missing during the summer months. Since then, the mansion has been classified as restricted because of safety concerns. No one is allowed to venture into the house anymore. "It's really nice here," the girl says as she snuggles up to her boyfriend, still staring out at the mansion. He sips a beer and nods at her, highly intoxicated. "Yeah, but I heard once the summer's over, this town kinda sucks. I also heard this weird guy talking about how there was a couple of missing people last summer. Some out-of-towners. They said they were going out to the mansion and then they just disappeared." She looks up at him as a chill runs down her spine. "What happened to them?" He makes a throat-cutting motion at her and tries to scare her. She pushes him away, irritated. "Knock it off, Bob. Seriously, what happened to them?" Bob shrugs, belches, and continues to drink his beer. "Drown? Fell through a floor and got impaled? Got eaten by a ghost? Who knows? I heard they searched the area but never found them. The more important question is, where can I pee?" He laughs and stands up, walking away for some privacy. She looks out at the mansion again and shudders. Want to go for a swim? She calls to him. As he relieves himself, he starts laughing. Why, so you can get eaten by a shark while I pass it on the beach? Maybe we can sneak out there and catch a ghost on film or whatever. Make some money off it. He doesn't hear a response. Babe? Babe. Linda? He turns around, unsteady on his feet, and stumbles back to where they were just sitting. Linda is nowhere to be found. He looks around confused. Hey Linda, if you're trying to scare me because of that stupid house out there, it isn't going to work. He staggers back and turns around, and a man with a scruffy beard and shoulder-length hair stares back at him. Hey there. You looking for someone? The man asks calmly with a southern accent. He smiles politely at Bob, seemingly interested in his response. Bob looks around again, confused and drunk. I was here with my girlfriend, Linda. I went off to take a leak, and now I can't find her. Bob stumbles again, and the man grabs his arm to steady him. Bob squints at him, trying to adjust his sight through his intoxication. Where did you come from? It's like you just appeared out of nowhere. The man chuckles and looks away, then returns his gaze with more intensity. Now that's just weird. Your girlfriend just disappearing and me just appearing? He looks up quickly, like he's just seen something. What was that? Bob turns around, unsteady, looking in the direction that the man did. But there's nothing there. What was what? He asks as he continues to look. When he doesn't get a reply, he turns back around, but the man is nowhere to be found. What the hell is going on? Bob mumbles. Hey you, someone whispers from above him. He quickly looks up and his face contorts in horror. He screams and tries to back away but falls into the sand. He tries to scoot back, but the man floats down over him, grabs him, and floats up into the air again. Bob screams for help, but the man covers his mouth. What's wrong? I thought you wanted to see Linda again, the man whispers. Then his face contorts into something monstrous. His eyes turn black as a shark's. His forehead hangs low over his eyes, and his skin pales to the gray of a corpse. Small dark veins run through his face, and his jaw elongates, exposing a set of long, deadly canine teeth that glisten in the moonlight. Bob screams even harder, but his screams are muffled through the vampire's hand. The vampire laughs and snaps his head forward, sinking his teeth into Bob's neck. The vampire releases his bite as blood gushes from Bob's neck. The vampire laughs as the blood squirts onto his face and shirt. The blood begins to stain Bob's shirt, and he starts to fade into a blissful unconsciousness. It doesn't hurt anymore. The vampire leans in and drinks deep from Bob's neck, slowly floating down to the ground again, taking the time to drain Bob's life away. By the time the vampire lands in the sand, Bob is limp in his arms. The vampire continues to drink until Bob's heart stops. He slowly raises his head and takes a deep, euphoric breath as the bloodlust calms down. He lets Bob's body slip from his arms and fall onto the blood-stained sand. He looks down and wipes his mouth with the back of his arm. "Ah, Bane, now we're going to have to clean this up," an Englishwoman says as she slowly and gracefully comes up to him. She too has a mouth covered in blood, although she has already transformed back into her human visage. Her name is Diana, and she's been a vampire for a very long time. She looks down at the body, amused. "You're such a slob," she says slowly as she runs her thumb over his lips, wiping the leftover blood from them, and places her thumb into her mouth. "This one was so drunk I can taste it." Bane chuckles. "Why do you think I picked him? I like the buzz. We can just take them back to the island and toss them in the water. The currents will do the rest." Diana nods at him, the edges of her blood-stained mouth curving up into a smile. "I forgot how much I love this town," Bane says. "More drunk, horny partiers than I can eat." Diana nods. "At least during the summer. After that we have to get takeout. But there are other towns around here that we can go to. Don't forget what Vince always says about feeding in the town you're in." "Something about a frog in a pond, right?" Bane smirks at her. Apart from hunting and killing, Bane's greatest pleasure is getting under people's skin, no matter who they are. That's why he chose the name Bane, after all. Diana scowls at him. The frog doesn't drink up the pond where it lives. Bane smirks again. "Yeah, that. That ain't why we're here anyways, now is it?" he asks her. Diana nods and smiles, closing her eyes. "The Witch's Gate. I can already feel its power. Can't you?"
Bane nods with a wicked smile as Diana looks down at Bob's corpse. We should be off. Vince will be waiting for us. You grab him. I'll grab the other one. So there you have it. Hopefully that piqued your interest and you'll want to read the rest of the story. Because I've been planning this book for a very long time, and this isn't the only story that I have to tell. So hopefully you can join my cast of characters in all of their adventures. So again, I say thank you for sticking with me so long and being patient as I worked on this book. I hope you enjoy the rest of it. The link is down below. Digital copy available now. Paperback, hardback, hopefully in the next couple of days. That's all I got for you guys tonight. Nighty-night, creatures of the night. And remember, as always, don't miss your chance to scream.